What exactly is happening in Ukraine right now? Chances are that, like me, you probably don't know. With the atrocities committed by Hamas on October the 7th and the subsequent destruction of large parts of Gaza, our attention has very definitely shifted. Yet despite the war on, let's not forget, Europe's eastern frontier, falling further and further down the news agenda, the conflict remains an existential issue for Ukrainians and arguably many others. It's even been suggested that after 18 months of fighting, there is now Ukraine fatigue, a growing dissatisfaction with the seemingly endless war plaguing both the public and Western policymakers. All the while, Ukraine keeps fighting, and through some of the worst weather in recent memory, snowstorms and floods having caused 10 deaths at the time of recording. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, we'll examine the potential consequences of this shift in focus. Later, we'll be hearing from a defence analyst, also a former diplomat, as to why Ukraine needs to remain at the front of our minds. Before that, though, one of our colleagues at NBC gave us an update as to the view from inside Ukraine itself.
My name is Anastasia Parafenyuk. I work and live in Kyiv, Ukraine. It's very cold lately. And knowing that it's very cold and the winter might be like this for the next 3 or 4 months, it's also quite depressing because we are now in this constant anxiety phase because of possible Russian airstrikes on our infrastructure. And last big drone attack was on Saturday, and it was really 6 hours of banning outside of my window. And some people I know, they're considering to move to the western part of Ukraine to live through the winter there. It's very depressing and sad to think about it. Plus, knowing that level of support for Ukraine, financial and weapon support, is not really stable right now comparing to last year. And it makes us really thinking about the future. It also makes us question the level of support that we're going to have soon.
Many thanks to Anastasia. Let me now introduce Dr Alexandra Walmsley, Defence Analyst, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Alexandra, just bring us up to date with the very latest in terms of the conflict itself.
Well, the Ukraine-Russia struggle carries on. It has been completely off the news agenda for the general media since the latest atrocities in Gaza. But the Ukrainians are still fighting to try and reclaim territory back that was seized by Russia. They've done an incredible job in confining the Russian Navy back to home port. For a country without a navy, that is a tremendous achievement that nobody's really that aware of unless you're following it in a specialist capacity. Kyiv has been the subject of drone attacks, but has been launching its own drone attacks against Russia. New equipment is coming regularly from the NATO allies, and training is ongoing with the Ukrainian forces by NATO allies. So the struggle continues, but if you were only following it from the perspective of the Western mass media, you would be unaware of that.
And of course, we are now moving very firmly into winter. Indeed, it feels like Ukraine has gotten there ahead of us. Some very, very serious weather conditions in parts of the country. How will that affect the tempo? Are we thinking we're straight back to where we were this time last year, where the Russians were deliberately targeting energy infrastructure, switching off the lights and turning off the heating, basically?
There's definitely an element of that. We are going to probably see, if the winter is a harsh one, there will be less sort of physical activity, less big advances, less seizing symbolic targets. But at the same time, the training of the Ukrainian forces goes on. They are getting to grips with the new equipment being donated. So it's not like nothing's happening, but it just may be harder to see overtly what is happening.
As you say, though, Alexandra, if you are not a specialist like yourself, if you're not consulting on a daily basis more specialist sources of information about what is taking place in Ukraine, you are a little bit clueless about it. I wonder, has that been picked up on by the Ukrainian public, do you think? Do they feel ignored?
I think we're starting to get a sense that they do. If you talk to particularly the refugee community here who have very strong links with their families back home, there is a sense, and President Zelensky has been very keen to get this message across that, please don't forget about us. Any forgetting about Ukraine is a psychological win for Putin and Russia. That really can't be allowed to happen.
A psychological win for Putin and Russia, I can see. But if the material, if the arms, if the money is still flowing from the West to Ukraine, does it really matter that much that it's not front page news in the way in which it was, a handful of weeks ago?
Unfortunately, I think it really does, because even though war is still fought very much on the battlefield, there is a huge component of the media reporting, because we've got so used to 24-hour news, to instant news with Twitter and other social media channels. And so when there is this silence, this vacuum, that can be filled by people who don't necessarily have Ukraine's best interests at heart. And we can't know for sure whether they are official Russian sources or just sources sympathetic to Putin, who are filling the social media void with comments about, Ukrainian forces lacking the will to fight, great Russian victories, highlighting, damage caused to Ukraine by drone attacks. And because we don't have the highly respected Western broadcasters who, since really February 2022, have been so embedded with the Ukrainians, getting regular airtime, the message doesn't come across that the will of the Ukrainians is stronger than ever, the commitment. Yes, it will probably be a very harsh winter. Yes, there will be probably energy shortages. But for the Ukrainian people, this is an existential fight.
There must be aspects of Ukrainian society where so many lives have been lost, so much time has been taken. This fight has been going on now for the best part of 2 years, and it doesn't look to me, at least, like there is an end in sight. That must have an effect on the Ukrainian population themselves.
This is a very familiar type of conflict to them, and the deprivations and the hardships, and that's things that you or I have no concept of, but we're in a very privileged position. I think that the Ukrainians, by all accounts and everything I'm hearing and the people I'm speaking to, the mood, no matter the deprivations and the hardships, the mood is more resilient than ever.
What then do you make of the idea that there is such a thing as Ukraine fatigue, be it in the leaders of Western nations, which to this point have been supplying Ukraine with what it needs, amongst the general public in the West as a whole, and perhaps even in Ukraine itself?
Oh, I'm sure that's very possible. I was walking down Whitehall earlier today, and there was no perception that this is a country, where there is a war raging on our continent. For the politicians sitting in Parliament, it's probably not their top issue. For people trying to sell newspapers, is Ukraine going to be the top story? And so when the eyes of the world are focused on other things, it's very difficult to remind ourselves that there is this terrible, terrible conflict happening very close to us.
Thank you, Alexandra. Stay where you are. In just a moment, we'll examine more closely this idea of Ukraine fatigue and what might well follow, even a temporary lack of focus by the West. Back in a moment.
The stronger Ukraine is on the battlefield, the stronger the hand will be on the negotiating table. So if you want a negotiated peaceful solution, which ensures that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, then the best way to get there is to continue to provide military support to Ukraine, and that's what the allies are going to do.
Now, that was NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg speaking as he arrived at the NATO summit earlier on Tuesday. He and the others gathering in Brussels would not wish to give anything other than the impression of continuing full-throated support for Volodymyr Zelensky. Yet in the margins of that meeting, no doubt there will be discussions about the competing foreign policy priorities countries like the US and UK are dealing with right now. Sir David Manning was a foreign policy advisor in Downing Street and our permanent representative at NATO. David, what exactly do you understand by the phrase Ukraine fatigue?
I think what I understand by it is that after 18 months of warfare and a perhaps overhyped expectation about the summer or autumn offensive that the Ukrainians were mounting, that there's some sense of disillusionment with where that has now reached, and it looks much more as though we're in a war of stalemate and attrition than in movement or quick results. And I think that it's not just that there's a sense of what is called Ukraine fatigue outside Ukraine, but I think Ukrainians themselves are feeling weary. They have lost certainly 100,000 men, probably more. And their country has been under bombardment for 18 months. They have seen 3-4 million people leave the country and be displaced. This is a very, very tough fight for them. And now they're on the verge of a very cold and difficult winter. And already we've seen the first winter blizzards sweeping across the south of the country. And in the West too, I think people feel that this has been going on a long time. We would like it to stop. We have provided an enormous amount of financial support and an enormous amount of materiel and armaments. And we hoped that this would bring about Ukrainian victory, and it's not immediately on the horizon. I think it's important not to overdo this narrative. I'm struck by the resilience of the Ukrainians themselves and of the continuing support they enjoy in the West.
We are all, of course, keeping very, very close eyes on what is taking place between Israel and Gaza at the moment, but we are all more than capable of holding more than one thought in our heads. So what is the danger, literally, to taking our eyes off that Russian ball?
We've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time with this. We've got to show that we're capable of supporting Ukraine and of dealing with the Middle East crisis at the same time. And I think that the argument you have to make to public opinion is that it's actually the argument Ukrainians make themselves, and I think very powerfully and eloquently, which is, this is your fight too. This is an existential fight for the survival of Ukraine. Putin wants to wipe it off the map. But if we lose our will to support them and look for some sort of compromise, then it's very unlikely Putin will stop there. He has imperial ambitions, and the only way that you can justify an imperial regime is to keep trying to rebuild what he sees as the ex-Soviet empire.
I'm sorry to interrupt, because, of course, you're not alone in making this point. We've heard the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, saying it. We've had, and I'm sure you know well, George Robertson, the former NATO Secretary General, saying that, Putin's ambitions are not limited to Ukraine. I have to ask the question, what is the evidence for that?
Well, I think we've got evidence of this from what he did in Georgia in 2008, when he invaded, and people tend to forget this now, but Abkhazia and Ossetia are still under Russian occupation. They are nominally independent states. I think there are 3 countries in the world, when I last looked, that actually recognize this. And although they haven't been formally annexed by Russia in the way that they have tried to annex the Donbass. And to your point, the evidence in Ukraine itself goes back to 2014. That is when Putin launched the first attack on Ukraine by taking Crimea and taking the Ukrainians very much by surprise, and then fomented this insurrection and this creeping annexation of eastern Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, the Donbass region, and then has tried to incorporate it into Russia.
I suppose, though, David, it is perhaps no coincidence that the debate in the United States and other places over the level of assistance being provided to Ukraine, it is no coincidence that that debate has deepened alongside the advent of the Israel-Hamas war, that has served to focus the minds particularly on the Republican benches.
I think the phenomenon of questioning and of saying, well, where have we got to with this war, would have happened regardless of the Israel-Gaza crisis.
True.
It would probably have worked itself out slightly differently because there would have been more time to focus on this. And it now is an issue in Republican Party politics, and it will be an election issue. There also have been voices around Europe who have been beginning to say, well, can we go on supporting this? Surely what we need is to reach a deal with Russia. The success of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands last week in the Dutch election, who is a skeptic about supporting Ukraine. It coincides with the mood of some in Germany, the far-right party called the Alternative for Deutschland. Mm-hmm. There are plenty of people around on the, let's say, far-right, extreme right in Europe who are also following this debate and have been expressing skepticism before. I mean, having said that, Neil, I think it's important to say that there are an awful lot of other people who don't go along with this, despite this pressure. I'm very struck by a poll I read in one of the newspapers today, which says that 75% of the Germans continue to support Ukraine.
What effect, then, do you think that the electoral cycle in the United States, and of course here in the United Kingdom, might have on the way in which those two nations support Volodymyr Zelensky?
I think the answer's easier for the United Kingdom. I see no reason at the moment to suppose that either a re-elected Conservative government or a new Labour government will change the position on Ukraine. It seems to me that is a cross-party position, and that there is full support for Ukraine and a realization in this country that Putin must be stopped here. And it's our duty to stand by a democracy that has been flagrantly attacked in this way. Yeah. I think it's not much doubt that Putin is hoping that Trump will be re-elected. Trump, after all, has a much more equivocal attitude, or certainly did, and record in his relationships with Putin than the Biden administration. He has said that he would be able to solve this problem in a day, so I believe. While he was president, he was notably skeptical about both NATO and indeed about the European Union, the two absolutely essential pillars of support for Ukraine.
David, what are the risks in the West not supporting Ukraine fully?
The fact is that if Putin is successful in taking over Ukraine, there is no reason to suppose that he will stop there. He is explicit about his imperial ambitions. And in fact, I think he needs his imperial vision to justify his increasingly totalitarian behavior at home. So I think we have to assume that he is somebody who will not stop, that whom we cannot negotiate with. Even if he were to negotiate, there's absolutely no reason to believe he would honor what he negotiated. He certainly didn't after the Crimea crisis. And Western Europe will not be able to get out of the way. We will not be able to dodge. It will become more and more expensive, more and more difficult to deal with this. We will be faced with a rapacious Russia that wants to take over probably Moldova, possibly the Baltic states, which becomes a much more intense and immediate crisis for Britain and its NATO allies, because Baltic states are NATO members. We have guaranteed their security. We would have to be involved or NATO would collapse.
And I suppose it's not just Russia that is looking to see how the West deals with the situation in Ukraine. There are countries, China, North Korea spring instantly to mind, who will also be keeping close eyes.
Well, you're quite right. It's about our credibility. If we have said we are going to stand by Ukraine, we must stand by Ukraine, or the other countries, other democracies, our other partners around the world will conclude that undertakings, guarantees, alliances are, if not worthless, at best dubious as far as they're concerned. And so you not only weaken yourself fatally in your relationship with Russia, but you undermine the position of liberal democratic societies who are looking for a rules-based order in the world, an order in which might is not right, which is what Putin wants. And you make it much more likely that they will in turn make compromises with or become allied to the autocracies who, quite frankly, are trying to change the terms of international political existence.
So David Manning, absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I suppose that is the point. Vladimir Putin may well persist in describing what's happening in Ukraine as a special military operation. Anyone else with eyes can see that it is a war, and one with consequences beyond Ukraine's borders. Yet those eyes need to be on Ukraine to make that assessment. Out of sight is out of mind. For Volodymyr Zelensky and every ordinary Ukrainian, it could also mean out of luck or even out of time. That's your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll be back again tomorrow.